These hands just removed a woman's pelvic organs for a student demonstration. It's 1821, and I stuffed them in my pocket to show my classroom. Later, I delivered a baby wearing these same clothes, and the mother died. I slept in my office, didn't have time to change. I got up and helped students deliver another baby, and that mother died too. A few more mothers died in the next week, and I don't know why. I don't know what's going on. This scenario really happened. I took it directly from the testimony of a Scottish doctor. The mothers all had puerperal fever. Some call it childbed fever. French gynecologist Jacques Herveau said epidemic puerperal fever is to women what war is to men. It cuts down its victims in the prime of their lives. It killed women after childbirth, and it killed newborn babies too. And even though it had been around for thousands of years, at least since Hippocrates, it was never really a problem until it could wipe out 1 in 4 mothers in early 19th century hospitals. And this epidemic, which no one could identify and no one could cure, was actually made worse by scientific progress. Even when a Hungarian doctor cracked the code of the most terrifying disease a mother could face, he became, as one of his biographers wrote, a martyr to the world's stupidity. Ignored, condemned, criticized, beaten, and dead at 47, Ignaz Semmelweis, who eventually became known as the savior of mothers, has almost been completely forgotten. But he's one of the reasons you grew up with a mother, and he's one of the reasons you grew up at all. So how did he solve a problem that Europe's finest scientific minds couldn't even identify? And why was he punished for it? In 1840s Europe, the forearms of a medical professional conducting an autopsy would be entirely covered in bodily fluids up to the elbow, including his shirt sleeves. The smell after the first abdominal incision was so putrid, literally the scent of putrefaction, decaying and dead tissue, that even the most experienced doctor had to turn away and bury his nose into his bent arm. Ugh. Students witnessing the dissection vomited, and when the abdominal wall was exposed, it revealed a slimy yellow-white fluid called exudate, a general word doctors use to describe an excreted fluid. Most doctors couldn't identify it at all. Others realized it was pus, and more thought it was coagulated fermented milk. After using cloth strips to wipe away the goo, Ignaz Semmelweis would show his students the severe organ inflammation that racked the insides of the new mother he'd just cut up. It was virtually the same scenario day after day, so common that morgue attendants described entering the hospital as a process of diagnose, operate, die, dissect. Semmelweis was born in 1818 in Buda, part of modern Budapest, in the Kingdom of Hungary, which was at the time part of the Habsburg Austrian Empire. As a young man, he studied law, which he didn't like, and spent most of his time arguing at coffee houses, until a friend invited him to an anatomy demonstration. He enrolled in the Vienna Medical School, then spent 2 years at the University of Pest before returning to Vienna. His main interest was actually in botany, with a dissertation called De Vita Plantarum, on the life of plants. He switched to obstetrics because he couldn't find a job. There are just more baby jobs than botany jobs. When he was appointed to Allgemein Krankenhaus, Vienna General Hospital, the finest hospital in continental Europe, there were 2 clinics for birthing mothers. Semmelweis was similar to a chief resident in the first clinic, which operated like a teaching hospital. Students from all over Europe who were enrolled in Viennese medical school worked alongside highly trained physicians to examine mothers-to-be, participate in live births, and engage in follow-up care. The second clinic was staffed by traditional midwives. Epidemics of childbed fever raged through the first clinic, with full rows of patients contracting the disease and dying. The second clinic had a very low rate of infection, and epidemics were rare. This was Semmelweis's first problem. Why did a disease run rampant through one wing of the hospital and not the other? And why did the most highly trained doctors in Europe see a shockingly high mortality rate among their patients, while the wing of midwives just didn't? Same building, completely different outcomes. Why? The two clinics admitted patients on alternating days, so if you were a pregnant mother in Vienna, it was the luck of the draw. People knew the grim results of the first clinic. They tried to time their deliveries to be admitted to the second clinic, but babies just kind of go on their own schedule. To purposefully avoid the first clinic, women would give street births. When a woman arrived having already had her baby, she was admitted to the second clinic for postnatal care. Street births were meant to be a category of emergencies, like when a mother couldn't get to the hospital in time. But isn't it worth taking your chances in your house or in the back of a wagon, or in some cases even on the stairs to the clinic, to avoid being assigned to the death wing? And there was some irony to the whole thing. The clinic set up to prepare thousands of doctors to bring life into the world was actually a factory of death. Okay, so this was the dominant theory of the day for what caused puerperal fever. Ready? Actually, that's not entirely true. Doctors felt that they did know, and that the disease was a mystifying combination of factors too complex to comprehend. In the centuries after Hippocrates, medical wisdom dictated that disease was a result of an imbalance of humors. By the 1600s, Thomas Sydenham used the phrase genius epidemicus to describe the tangled web of natural factors that led to illness. Eventually, these theories fell under a general description of cosmic, atmospheric, telluric, which encompassed every possible natural variable you could imagine. Did a group of mothers develop puerperal fever because the barometric pressure was bad during a certain phase of the moon when it rained on a day after the mothers didn't get enough sunlight for a week? And then you can just sprinkle in God's mysterious will and Earth's desire for perfect balance, and voila! You get an epidemic. You get an epidemic, and you get an epidemic. The miasmic theory made a little more sense, that diseased air infected patients. A puerperal fever epidemic in Paris in 1664 was believed to be the result of locating a maternity ward directly above a surgical clinic. Coarse and infectious vapors which arose from the wounds and ulcers of wounded bodies created a mass of impure and malignant air. The air perpetually rose upward and was inhaled day and night by the newly delivered women. The women fell into a bloody flux that ended only with their death. The stench of life in the 1800s is hard to comprehend. Human sewage, animal feces, rotting garbage, stagnant water, smoke from factories, especially in cities. It wasn't crazy to think that environmental quality caused human bodies to get sick. And even in a cutting-edge facility like Vienna General, patients were lined up in rows, often so close that they could touch each other's hands. In his etiology, Semmelweis wrote that designers of early maternity floors of European hospitals put a privy in the corner. But after too many young mothers disposed of their newborns by throwing them into the privies, human waste was collected in bedpans. It was not a super luxurious time to be alive. Further complicating miasmic and cosmic atmosphere telluric origins were ideas that an individual patient's characteristics and circumstances contributed to the disease. Things like feelings of guilt or shame for pregnancy out of wedlock, a habit of wearing undergarments too tightly during pregnancy, inadequate nutrition, hysteria, depression, or just plain underwhelming genes. Milk metastasis at least had a somewhat rational basis. A mother infected with puerperal fever saw her milk production dry up, right when the milky, slimy exudate was being produced inside her, so her milk must be spreading around her body and rotting. This jumbled mix of pseudoscience and mysticism is what Semmelweis was up against when, as a young doctor, he just had a very simple question. Why did so many more mothers die in the first clinic than the second clinic? Even without knowing anything about the disease or how its epidemics happened, he knew there had to be a difference between the two clinics. The first thing he did was assemble the statistics. Between 1841 and 1846, the first and second clinics had similar numbers of births, around 20,000 compared to about 18,000. And while mortality numbers fluctuated by the year, 9.92% of mothers admitted to the first clinic died, while just 3.9% of those in the second clinic died. A pregnant woman who was assigned to the first clinic was about 2.5 times more likely to never leave the hospital alive than if she'd just been lucky enough to go to the second. Semmelweis started by completely rejecting the cosmic atmospheric telluric theories as being logically absurd. With two clinics sharing the same earthly conditions, all of those vague nebulous forces should affect the populations of both pretty equally. And even if some unseen force was swirling around the hospital, why did women so often develop puerperal fever in rows, affecting some rows and skipping others? Did the cosmos play eeny, meeny, miny, mo and infect women in alternating straight lines? Probably not. So what he did was he began to just chip away at what he saw as a giant logic puzzle. The epidemic influences are working upon the individual either before her admission to the lying-in hospital, or they work upon her during her stay. If they affect the individual outside the maternity hospital, then those admitted to the first division are certain, as well as those who present themselves at the second division for admission, to be exposed to the pernicious action of the epidemic influences outside the lying-in hospital. And then such a great difference in the mortality ratios could not exist in the two divisions, both of which admit individuals subject to epidemic influences. Okay, basically, if mothers were catching the disease outside of the hospital before they were admitted, both wings would have similar infection rates. Semmelweis concluded that something was happening inside the hospital. To further bolster that theory, he acknowledged that mothers who gave birth outside the hospital, both the street births and the ones who didn't come in at all, had very low rates of puerperal fever. The hospital was the problem. He put together what would eventually be 64 tables of data in his etiology, which showed that there was no pattern to the swells of epidemic or receding infection rates. The epidemic influences are so powerful that their pernicious activity cannot be restrained at any season of the year, that they rage in the depth of winter and during the oppressive summer heat with equal violence. However, the epidemic influences are partial in that they do not scourge all lying-in hospitals to the same extent, but spare certain institutions and decimate the inmates of others without mercy. Indeed, they go so far in their partiality as even to attack with unequal severity different sections of one and the same institution. There are endemic noxious agents which manifest themselves in such a frightful fashion only within the limits of the first obstetrical clinic. Awesome! Now he just had to figure out what the problem was. Was it treatment for the disease? Both clinics applied the same methods and care once a mother was sick, and Both clinics experienced the same rates of mortality for the infected. It was getting infected in the first place that was the issue. Another suggestion was one of the simplest: overcrowding and the poor conditions that resulted from it. But Semmelweis dismissed that. Remember how mothers were clamoring and literally scheming to get into the second clinic? The second clinic, the one with the much lower mortality rate? It was actually the overcrowded one. It was time for the next theory. Blame the priest. Women were dying in the first clinic with such alarming frequency that a clergyman was available to administer last rites at all hours of the day. To get to the first clinic beds, he had to pass through 5 rooms. To get to the second clinic beds, he passed through no other rooms. Was the ever-present priest picking up and carrying infection? Semmelweis wrote that, "During my first term of service, I appealed to the humanity of this servant of God and, without difficulty, attained my wish that the priest in the future should go in a roundabout way to the wards, unattended and without the ringing of the bell and without passing through the other wards, so no one was aware of the presence of the priest, outside of the patients actually in the ward." Did it help? No, it didn't help. Nothing changed, so he checked Padre off the list. One major difference between the methods of the first clinic and the second was the physician's use of forceps, essentially mechanical baby tongs that could slide in, grab onto a baby's head, and reposition it for an easier birth. There was some tissue damage when forceps were used, but Semmelweis concluded that it was nothing compared to the extreme strain and destruction of the birth process itself. So, forceps weren't the problem. What about ventilation? Ventilation was exactly the same between the clinics, and so were the bed linens. So it wasn't that stuff either. Semmelweis was probably the hardest working man in Vienna General. He woke up early so he could get a few autopsies in before committing the rest of his day to examining patients and treating them. He collected every clue he could, like realizing first-time mothers were particularly susceptible to developing puerperal fever. The only significant operational difference between the two clinics is that in the first clinic, mothers gave birth on their backs, in the position we generally use today, while in the second clinic, mothers gave birth on their sides. Semmelweis switched up the first clinic to side birthing, and nothing changed. Meanwhile, hospitals in England didn't have nearly as much of a childbed fever problem as continental hospitals. The English had an early obsession with basic cleanliness, like clean sheets and floor scrubbing. Professor Johann Klein ran the two clinics, and his predecessor, Professor Bohr, adhered to the English cleanliness model beginning in 1789. Over 65,000 deliveries, Bohr oversaw a mortality rate of 1.3%, and it was just 0.8% in his final year. When Klein took over from Bohr, he discarded the busy work of frequent cleaning. Just the basics were fine, okay? And cleaning to the English standard had no influence on the cosmic, atmospheric, telluric factors anyway, and it only had a negligible effect on the general miasma. In Klein's first year, mortality rose to 7.8%, but that was probably just bad luck, right? Semmelweis had been vocal about trying to crack the code of childbed fever since he first realized it was an internal hospital issue, and Klein knew about Semmelweis's ambitions to find a cure. So Klein demoted Semmelweis. A month after his dismissal, the first clinic's abysmal record became a popular political issue within the emperor's court, and a commission was formed to get to the bottom of it. The commission did not include Semmelweis or his supportive and influential teachers like the brilliant dermatologist Joseph Skoda or pathologist Karl von Rokitansky. The commission seems to have been handpicked by Klein. They spent a few hours at the hospital, talked to Klein for an hour in his office, and drew a single conclusion. Examinations in the first clinic were rougher than those from the midwives in the second clinic and caused more tissue damage. And who damages more tissue than anyone? Men. And foreigners. Non-Austrians who were judged to be less gentle than their native counterparts were removed from the courses of study, and the remaining males were encouraged to give exams a little more carefully. The clunky brute force attitude toward reaching a solution echoes a sentiment from a professor shortly after Vienna General's founding. Our ancestors laid much stress on the success of their treatment of the sick. We, however, on the result of our investigations. Our tendency is purely scientific. The physician should be judged by the extent of his knowledge and not by the number of his cures. It is the investigator, not the healer, that is to be appreciated in the physician. We think of doctors now as treating patients first and foremost, with research as a distant second. We generally consider researchers to occupy a distinctly different role altogether. But in the 18th and 19th centuries, continental Europe's dangerous obsession with scientific progress often trumped everything in training physicians, including patient care and outcomes. When you went into a hospital like Vienna General, you were thought to be lucky for the opportunity to grace the presence of the most brilliant minds in medicine, and you were at their mercy and pleasure. And if you actually got better, well, good for you. Semmelweis just wasn't like that. He was heartbroken by seeing so many mothers die, seemingly needlessly and at random, many who came into the hospital in perfectly good health. Investigation was a necessary part of figuring out what made childbed fever so deadly, but his focus was on saving mothers' lives. And finally, after his tireless pursuit of uncovering the truth, he found his answer. And all it took was his friend's bizarre and untimely death. Which delicious hot dog should I microwave for dinner tonight? None of them! Because America's #1 ready-to-eat meal kit is delivering fresh, never-frozen meals to my door. So I don't have to worry about flooding my exploded hot dog crevice with disgusting mustard water. Factor has plans like Calorie Smart, Keto, Protein Plus, or Chef's Choice, whatever fits your personal goals, and it's all dietitian approved. So whether you're trying to cut back on takeout or just want nutritious meals ready in 2 minutes without any prep, mess, or trips to the grocery store, Factor is an unbelievable value and service. And Factor's now owned by HelloFresh, and with a wider array of meal plans to choose from, there's something for everyone. And it's so easy. So head to Factor75.com or click the link below and use code VSAUCE250 to get 50% off your first Factor box. Thanks to them for sponsoring Vsauce2. That's Factor75.com and code VSAUCE250 for 50% off your first Factor box. Semmelweis actually had a bit of good luck for once. The man who'd taken his old position was moving on, so he was in line to take it back. He took a short vacation to Venice, but when he returned, he found out that one of his friends and supporters, Jakub Kolečka, a forensic medical professor, was dead after accidentally cutting his finger during one of those gloveless, messy autopsies. He died of pyemia, a blood infection that spread throughout his body. Semmelweis wrote that he was stuck in the finger by a student with a knife that was used during the post-mortem and died during my absence in Venice of a bilateral pleuritis, pericarditis, peritonitis, and meningitis. And some days before his death, a metastasis formed in one eye. They were all the same afflictions that Semmelweis had seen time after time, literally every single day of his career at Vienna General, in declining mothers infected with puerperal fever and then in detail inside their bodies after he dissected them. The problem in the first clinic and what was driving the inexplicable rise of puerperal fever epidemics in the 1800s didn't have much to do with motherhood at all. Semmelweis said the exciting cause of Professor Kolechka's illness was known. That is to say, the wound produced by the autopsy knife was contaminated at the same time by cadaveric material. Not the wound, but the contamination of the wound by cadaveric material was the cause of death. It turns out that doctors and students who spend the first half of the day rummaging around the insides of putrid dead bodies with their bare hands and who then transfer the cadaver filth directly into the sensitive reproductive tissues of a woman who is about to have that entire area ripped apart in childbirth, it turns out they spread a little bit of disease. The midwives kept their hands out of dead people's guts. Everything Semmelweis had seen and noticed started to make sense. The data started to make sense. Neither the pupils or the midwives in the second clinic were spending any time conducting autopsies. They simply were not coming into contact with dead, rotting tissue that could cause infection. Cool. Now what? It's important to realize that in the 1840s, no one understood that bacteria or viruses existed as their own tiny living particles. Semmelweis couldn't see what the infecting agent was, but he sure could smell it because the hands, skin, and clothes of dissecting physicians stunk like dead, decaying bodies all the time. Sort of like farmers smelling like fertilizer. You just get used to it and you don't even notice it. Semmelweis once again turned to the brilliance of the most simple logic. If he could smell it, it's there. Whatever it is. If the scent is gone, it's probably not there. So, what would get rid of the smell? As he tried to find a suitable stink killer, the rest of his logic fell into place. Why did women develop puerperal fever in rows? Because they were examined in rows with the same infected hands. Why did those street birth women avoid infection? Because they never encountered decaying tissue in the first place. Why did the English sanitation model seem to work better? And why did Vienna's mortality rate skyrocket when they gave it up? Because filth. And it wasn't just hands. Inserting tainted forceps was pretty much like injecting the disease. Even that weird blame the foreigners explanation made sense. The foreign students were more motivated than the Austrian natives and participated much more frequently and actively in autopsies and exams. More involvement equals more infection. Starting in May of 1847, Semmelweis decided on a mixture of chlorinated lime and mandated that all staff wash their hands with it before examining patients. Bowls of chlorinated water with sand for scrubbing were placed at the entrances of the clinic. Hand washing itself wasn't new, but since soap and water didn't take away the dead body's smell, Semmelweis knew it wasn't negating the infecting agent. In June, the mortality rate was down to 2.38%. In July, 1.2%. And in August, it was 1.89%. Semmelweis had the data, but Klein, his superior, was furious. And the staff absolutely hated doing it. That part kinda makes sense. Think about it from a medical student's perspective. You're being forced to cover your skin in a serious irritant when soap and water seems to do just fine. It smells terrible. There's a reason why chlorine gas was an effective chemical weapon in World War I. It's noxious and hard on the lungs. And why exactly are you doing this? To supposedly combat something you can't see and which runs counter to thousands of years of medical wisdom because a weird little man is making you do it despite his own boss telling everyone it's stupid? It also wasn't foolproof, and Semmelweis was forced to continually refine his theory. When 11 of 12 women in a row of beds all contracted puerperal fever, it seemed to completely disprove the Semmelweis chlorine washing doctrine. But after investigating the scenario, it turned out that the first patient was suffering from uterine cancer, and decayed tissue and discharge contaminated her examiner's hands, which also meant two new pieces of information. The infection didn't just come from dead bodies in the morgue, and only washing her hands with chlorine on the way into the clinic wasn't enough. Now all the examining materials had to be washed constantly, and those students and nurses who complained about chlorine washing upon entrance were now being told to do it after seeing every single patient. The results were fantastic, and Semmelweis was sure they'd speak for themselves. But he was wrong. Catastrophically wrong. Because his reward for saving countless mothers' and babies' lives was the complete and utter destruction of his own. Colleagues who found his discovery compelling encouraged him to publish his findings everywhere he could, not least of which was the relevant medical journals of the day. He refused, repeatedly citing his discomfort with writing. After all, why did it matter? He was training foreign doctors who would go home to their native countries and spread his methods to the world. He really just wanted to save lives. As the revolutions of 1848 escalated throughout Europe, Vienna was one of its centers. Semmelweis wore the uniform of an academic legion that supported reforms and Hungarian independence. After the revolution was suppressed in 1849, those who had remained loyal to the Austrian Empire wielded an even greater power than before. Klein, still Semmelweis's boss and by now nemesis, was one of them. In March of that year, Klein fired Semmelweis, despite the first clinic's mortality rates finally being below the second clinic's, and he replaced him with a man who had invented a decapitation hook for cutting up babies who died within their mother's womb. Sweet. And although a few others were writing about his chlorine regimen and its effectiveness, they often got one major detail wrong. They only mentioned cadaverous tissue contamination, leaving out that living organisms could spread infection. It seems like a tiny detail, but it was a fatal flaw. It meant that when others tried to replicate an incomplete Semmelweis doctrine, it simply wouldn't work consistently, and if it's not consistent, then the real cause must be something else. A hospital in Prague delivered a serious blow to the theory. For a month and a half, they instituted chlorine washing and reduced their visits to the pathology lab. They observed no decrease in infection, and after they stopped, the epidemic went away on its own. It just turns out that they implemented the system badly and fudged the data. A century later, Frank G. Slaughter said of their refutation of Semmelweis, "The whole is a sickening document of interest in showing with what energy and ingenuity men can conduct themselves in the fight against truth." Semmelweis had made a discovery that would change the world, and almost no one believed him. He returned to Budapest and managed the clinic at St. Rochus. He implemented his chlorine regimen, and over the course of 6 years, the number of mothers who died from puerperal fever was 0.85%. And no one cared, except his critics. Karl Braun, the Klein-loving decapitation tool professor who replaced him in Vienna, published a list of 30 causes of puerperal fever, including high room temperature and the emotions of the mother. He buried cadaveral tissue contact in point number 28. Semmelweis came to understand that nearly all the critics' supposed failures of his method were the result of inadequate implementation. like the time when an epidemic broke out in his own clinic. He traced it back to a lazy nurse who didn't bother changing bed linens of the infected when a new patient was put in the bed. He grew increasingly frustrated. After another outbreak, he found out that the hospital had contracted with the lowest priced laundry service to wash patient linens. When he realized they were shipping the linens back to the hospital without washing them at all, Semmelweis threw the pus-covered bedding at the face of the hospital administrator who was trying to save a buck. As his resentment grew, he burned so many bridges and provoked so many critics by threatening the medical and scientific establishments that his personality started to change. He did get married to a woman who made him very happy, and his wife then became pregnant. But the baby died days after birth. They tried again, and that daughter died from peritonitis after just 4 months. He was at times racked by guilt over having spent so many years inadvertently infecting mothers, so many of them so young, and sending them to an early death. How many thousands were killed under his watch? It ate away at him. He wrote, "God only knows the number of women I have consigned prematurely to the grave, for I have occupied myself with the cadaver to a degree reached by few obstetricians." And he wasn't alone in his grief. The obstetrician Gustav Michaelis, who himself was a pioneer in the field, he did groundbreaking research on the role of the narrow pelvis in childbirth, learned of Semmelweis's methods, and became a strict practitioner of chlorine washing. He eventually realized that his prior techniques had resulted in the deaths of so many women, including his own niece. He never got over knowing that he was the reason she died. That's why he threw himself under a train in Hamburg. But no matter how bad things got, Semmelweis knew he was saving lives by the thousands, and his under 1% mortality rate at the Pest Clinic continued to prove it. Finally, after a decade of refusal, he decided to write and publish his treatise on the prevention of puerperal fever. His 525-page book, The Etiology, Concept, and Prophylaxis of Childbed Fever, is one of the most comprehensive, exhaustive works of medical literature in history. He detailed every piece of his own professional experience before identifying what childbed fever is, laying bare all its known causes, and prescribing every measure to prevent its contraction and spread, before devoting over 100 pages to addressing the voluminous criticism of his theories. Wikipedia gives a single short paragraph to the medical magnum opus that ended up saving millions of mothers. The book explains how his research shows that hand hygiene in hospitals can prevent unnecessary deaths. You would just think it'd be more of a big deal, but guess not. Semmelweis had discovered his life-saving chlorine revolution while he was still in his 20s. By his late 30s, when he began writing his etiology, his personality really started to change. He was incredibly kind with his patients, and although he'd always been difficult with everyone else, he was getting worse. Historian Istvan Benedek wrote that his whole life shows clearly that he was a psychopathic personality. He was tormented, irritable, hot-tempered, monomaniacally clinging to his own sphere of thought, in consequence quarrelsome even with his friends, rash in his judgment on those who looked unfavorably upon his hypothesis, often coarse. Benedict said he even started to argue with his friends, ranting so excitedly that they just didn't want to be around him anymore. He started to attack his critics in the medical press with a series of open letters that were dripping with invective and personal insults. He ran the numbers on his old clinic in Vienna, finding that in the decade after he left, 1,924 women died needlessly from puerperal fever. He wrote, In this massacre, you, Herr Professor, have participated. There is no other course open for me except to keep watch, and every man who dares spread dangerous errors regarding puerperal fever will find in me an active opponent. This murder must cease, and in order that the murder ceases, I will keep watch, and anyone who dares to propagate dangerous errors about childbed fever will find in me an eager adversary. In order to put an end to these murders, I have no resort but to mercilessly expose my adversaries, and no one whose heart is in the right place will criticize me for seizing this expedient. He derided one of his harshest critics, Friedrich Wilhelm Scanzoni, for publishing a history of childbed fever that ran counter to his theories of contagion and prophylaxis. His response to Scanzoni was savage. Should you, without having disproved my doctrine, continue to train your pupils in the doctrine of epidemic childbed fever, I declare before God and the world that you are a murderer, and the history of childbed fever would not be unjust to you if it memorialized you as a medical Nero. An obstetrics professor at Freiburg described how Semmelweis would confront total strangers on the street, not physicians or students, just normal people walking by, to argue about the superiority and necessity of his chlorine doctrine. He began drinking heavily and spending a great deal of time with a prostitute. He boasted to friends and colleagues about his massive wealth, despite having none at all. But the most shocking evidence of his decline is the comparison of two photos of Semmelweis. One at the prime of his personal and professional life. He and his wife had 3 more healthy children who lived. He had successfully administered all his clinics and saved more lives than he could ever begin to count. He was just about to embark on writing one of the most important texts in medical history. He was robust, serious, and still only 39 years old. Just 3 years later, he was elderly. He'd turned completely gray. He was frail. In his 3 years of writing and arguing, he aged about 30. At a dinner with friends, he rose and began an excited speech of entirely unintelligible words. His wife took him home. At a department meeting, he began reading from a piece of paper. He was reciting the midwife's oath, which had nothing at all to do with the topic at hand. There are several different theories to explain Semmelweis's decline, and all of them have compelling elements. One historian guessed that he had acquired early onset dementia in the form of Alzheimer's disease. His confusion, erratic behavior, and mental decline seemed to fit that. A more modern theory is that he began to suffer from bipolar disorder in his 30s. His vicious cycles of manic professional productivity and depressive lulls support that. Another suggests he was afflicted with advanced syphilis, and that's possible too, as it wasn't uncommon for gynecologists and autopsy specialists to contract the disease. But he also was just a broken man, broken from the weight of human suffering, much of which was at his own hands. Broken from the pushback of the scientific and medical community who largely rejected what he knew would eventually save millions. His colleagues and wife agreed that he needed to be taken to a sanatorium in Vienna for mental health treatment. He tried to leave. He said he needed to get back to attend to his patients, and he was forcibly restrained by 6 staff. They put Semmelweis in a straitjacket and locked him in a dark room. 14 days later, he was dead. Almost no one went to his funeral. Not his children, not even his wife. His autopsy showed that he'd been severely beaten multiple times, and it also showed a small cut on his finger and the same symptoms of pyemia infection that killed his colleague Kolechka years prior. Ignaz Semmelweis died from the same exact streptococcal infection that had killed an incalculable number of innocent mothers in the last century, and the exact same infection he dedicated his life to preventing. Joseph Lister began implementing his use of carbolic acid for antisepsis on August 12, 1865, 2 days before Semmelweis died. You may have rinsed your mouth with Listerine this morning, and if not, you still know what it is. In 1879, the chemist and germ theory pioneer Louis Pasteur was at a conference in Paris discussing puerperal fever, where Jacques Herveau, the man who had likened childbed fever to war, blamed the epidemic on foul miasma. Pasteur interrupted him, saying, "None of those things caused the epidemic. It is the nursing and medical staff who carry the microbe from an infected woman to a healthy one." When Herveau told Pasteur that he was afraid the organism at fault can never be seen or found, Pasteur went to the chalkboard, drew a diagram of Streptococcus bacteria, and said, "There, that is what it looks like." And you know, Pasteur, you might have drank pasteurized milk today, too. But I can guarantee you've never Semmelweised your hands to kill the bacteria on them. And when you skinned your knee as a kid, your mom didn't Semmelweis the wound before she put the Band-Aid on. Belief perseverance is a desire to continue to adhere to a belief even after new information completely disproves it. And sometimes it can even strengthen the refuted belief, especially when it contradicts centuries of professional wisdom. Timothy Leary described a special strain of belief perseverance as mob behavior found among primates and larval hominids on undeveloped planets, in which a discovery of important scientific fact is punished. He called it the Semmelweis reflex. It's all so hard to believe that it makes for outstanding drama. In Henry Ibsen's 1882 play, An Enemy of the People, Dr. Thomas Stockman reveals a bacterial contamination in a local spa, and for that public service, he is punished severely. The 1939 Oscar winner for Best Short Subject starred Shepard Strudwick as a struggling Semmelweis in That Mothers Might Live. And at the Harold Pinter Theatre in London's West End, the 2.5-hour Dr. Semmelweis is playing right now. Was Ignaz Semmelweis just a sad, unfortunate victim of his own revolutionary progress? Was it his own fault for not publishing his results sooner and for fighting with virtually everyone, including his own friends? Or was he fated to be like Cassandra in Greek mythology, who was given the gift of prophecy, but cursed so that no one would ever believe her warnings? Probably all of it. Theoretical physicist Max Planck said, "A scientific truth does not triumph by converting its opponents and making them see the light, but rather because its opponents eventually die and a new generation grows up that is familiar with it." Ignaz Semmelweis condensed his own story, one of the most tumultuous biographies in scientific history, into a single sentence. "My doctrines exist to rid maternity hospitals of their horror, to preserve the wife for her husband and the mother for her child. And because of that, you are alive." And as always, thanks for watching.